Pennies on the tracks. When I was a little girl, I had a penny collection in a box on my dresser. Oh, it wasn't one of those regular collections, although I had one of those too. The blue folders in three parts that had the little indentations where you could put the pennies in. But my favorite pennies, the ones that were in the box on my dresser, they were the flattened pennies. And they'd been flattened in the very best way. They'd been flattened by trains. Now, when I was a girl, we lived just a few blocks away from train tracks. And trains always seemed really exotic and adventurous and exciting. I'd never ridden on a real train, and it would be years before I did. But I loved to watch them. My brother and sister and I would often walk down to the tracks, and many times I would put pennies on the train track, usually 3, a magical number, and then we would wait for the train. 5 o'clock, it was never late. You could hear the faraway whistle, and then it came closer. Clackety-clack, 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 louder, louder, closer, closer, faster, faster, until with a whoosh, it went by. And then I'd look for my pennies. Sometimes they were completely gone, and sometimes a few feet down the track. But when I found them, I'd pick them up and run my fingers across that smooth, warm surface. And then I'd take them home and put them in my penny box. Of course, trains always had, besides excitement, an element of danger. And sometimes my brother and sister and I, we would walk a few feet on the bridge that crossed Foothill Boulevard. And we would imagine that if a train came by at that very moment, we would be in terrible danger and we'd have to run for our lives. Which was true, sort of. But what was also true was that we were not so very brave, and we didn't do anything so very dangerous. We would walk maybe a foot or two onto the bridge, and never when a train was coming. But when I was a girl, when my parents had to go out for one reason or another, we would have babysitters. Our usual babysitter was an older woman named Mrs. Swanson, who lived down at the end of the block. But sometimes we would have the teenagers who lived nearby babysit. The teenager on one side was Annette Cottam, and I thought she was very cool. She was pretty, and she had a boyfriend, and she had homework, and she had the same name as the most glamorous of the Mouseketeers. Now on the other side, Robert Christmas. All the neighborhood kids thought it was so great that they had Christmas for a last name. And when Robert's little sister was born, well, we were all really disappointed. Well, really more outraged that they named her Laura instead of Mary. How could they have missed such a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity? Well, whenever we had babysitters, I would ask for bedtime stories. And Mrs. Swanson, she told very traditional stories. They usually had a moral to them, like what horrible things would happen to you if you weren't polite to people. Annette would tell us stories about her dates, but Robert would tell us scary stories. Real, true, scary stories. And one night, this was the story he told for a bedtime story. He said there was once a girl named Rosemary. She was about your age, I think. And she really loved to go down to the train tracks and put pennies on the tracks. And most of the time it was no problem. But one time, the train just hit those pennies wrong and the whole train derailed. There was a horrible wreck and everyone was killed, all 187 people. And the ghosts of those 187 people, they began to haunt Rosemary. Night after night, she'd be lying in her bed and she'd hear the faraway sound of the train whistle and then the clackety-clack, louder, louder, faster, faster, closer, closer, until the train would just burst through the wall of her room and go out the other wall. Of course, it didn't do any damage to the walls. It was a ghost train. But when it did, well, those 187 ghosts would go right through her head. And when they did, they would shriek. And Rosemary couldn't sleep. It happened every single night. She was terrified and exhausted. And after a while, she went completely mad. Her parents had to put her in an asylum. But the ghost train and the ghosts, they didn't stop. It probably didn't help that the asylum was near some train tracks too. But every night, as before, the train would come whooshing through Rosemary's room and the ghost would scream. She couldn't take it anymore. Finally, one night, Rosemary escaped, and she went down to the train tracks and stood on the tracks. And a real train, not a ghost train, came along, and that was the end of Rosemary. And then my babysitter said, and that's the end of the story. Good night, and he turned out the light. I couldn't sleep. I was just like Rosemary. I put pennies on the tracks. Of course, I hadn't heard of any train wreck. I didn't know of any people that were killed, but what if it was just a delayed reaction? What if the damage was done when the trains came by where I lived on Foothill Boulevard, but the wreck didn't happen for several more miles? The ghost would still know it was me. They would come and haunt me. Right then, I vowed to never put another penny on a train track. And I felt very lucky to have avoided Rosemary's fate. Well, many, many years later, I made a visit to the little town of Jonesboro in Tennessee for the National Storytelling Festival. On my first day there, I walked up to a little cluster of cute shops, and I thought that perhaps I could find something to take home as a souvenir for my children. Nothing really appealed to me, but as I was walking back to the storytelling tents, I had to cross the train tracks because a train runs right through the town of Jonesboro. And as I did, I remembered that bedtime story from so many years ago. I remembered how scared I was. I thought, how could he have done that to a little girl? I was so gullible. I believed every single word. And then thinking about stories and storytelling, I realized that even at a young age, a simple story could terrify me. It could spark my imagination, and it could change my actions. And right then I knew exactly what I would take home for a souvenir for my children. Flattened pennies. And so I reached into my wallet and I pulled out 5 pennies, one for each child. I put them carefully on the track and I went off to hear stories. In the middle of the stories, well, the train came through. Now, a storyteller was prepared for that possibility, and so he wove that very cleverly into his story. The audience chuckled appreciatively, and I knew that back at the tracks, my pennies were flattened. So after the session was over, I walked back and found my pennies. I ran my fingers over them, feeling that warm smoothness, a memory from long ago, and I put them into the pocket of my jacket. The next morning, I was back at the storytelling tent for more stories. Pennies still in the pocket of my jacket. And the MC began with the usual announcements. The location of the porta potties, the names of the businesses that had sponsored the storytelling, the prohibition for sound recording or flash photography. Oh, and he said there's just one more thing. It seems that some people at the Amtrak station at the next town over, they called the festival office, and they said someone had been seen putting something on the tracks. They said to remind our audiences that it is dangerous and also illegal to put anything on the tracks. And if anybody was caught doing that, they could be subject to fines or even a lawsuit. Oh, yikes. That was me. I looked down at the ground. I figured nobody could possibly know that I was the one who had put something on the tracks. And I vowed for the second time in my life never to put anything on the tracks again. But this time I had to ask myself, what was it I was afraid of? Ghosts? Or maybe the law? And that's my story about pennies on the tracks.